Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Package Tourist, hosted by yours truly, the Package Tourist, and the magical mystery tour called Life, Matthew DiBiase. Tonight's guest is author John Bruning. John lives in Oregon, and since 1996, he has written or co-authored 25 books dealing with military history. His books cover such topics as Navy SEALs, the war in Afghanistan, the Battle of the Bulge, and the air war in Korea. And tonight, we will be discussing his latest book, 53 Days on Starvation Island, the World War II battle that saved Marine Corps Aviation, which was released last May. Tonight, we will pay tribute to John Bruning's writing career. John, welcome to the show. It's a great honor and privilege to have you on. I'd like to start off by asking you, John, would you please tell our audience about your latest book, 53 Days on Starvation Island?
Well, thank you first, Matt, for having me on your program. I really appreciate it, and I'm just really happy to be here tonight. I haven't had a chance much to talk about the book recently because my dad recently passed. So
I'm sorry.
It's been a real rough last 6 months or so. So being able to sit down and talk about 53 days and the Marines I got to write about in the book really is it just brings me back to the center of my universe and what I love the most, which is history. 53 Days is the story of the first two Marine Corps squadrons that went into Guadalcanal, and the 53 days they spent defending and fighting for the island during America's first offensive of World War II. And it's seen through the eyes principally of the three main Marines who held those two squadrons together, and that would be Major John L. Smith and Captain Marion Carl from VMF 223, the fighter squadron, and Major Richard Mangrum, who was the skipper of VMS B 232, which was the dive bomber squadron. And between them, they had 19 F-4F Wildcats and 12 SBD Dauntlesses. And for 53 days, they flew and fought every day. They were shot at on the ground. They were sniped by Japanese in trees. In fact, several were wounded that way. And they were bombed during the daytime and at night, and shelled by naval gunfire at night as well. And several times the perimeter that their airfield was being defended, the Marine perimeter was nearly breached. And Japanese troops actually got to the airfield on one of those occasions, which I talk about at the climax of the book. So that's the basic story. It's not an in-depth tactical or strategic look at the Battle of Guadalcanal. There are fine historians who've done incredible jobs with that aspect of the campaign. But what I had set out to do is really try to tell the human story of what it was like for the first aviators there and what they went through, because I think all too often, especially 232, gets overlooked, and the accomplishments and the contribution they made to the campaign, I was hoping to highlight, because it really has been lost to history. So that was the whole purpose of the book.
Let's talk a little about, okay, you mentioned three men, John L. Smith, Marion Carl, and was it Robert Mangrum. Okay, where did John Smith come from? Where did he come from?
So John L. Smith was a University of Oklahoma graduate. He was an ROTC officer in the and he served in the Marine Artillery at the beginning of his career before transferring to aviation. And he later flew dive bombers after he got through flight training, and then very early on he was tagged for early promotion as the war began. Actually, this ruffled some feathers, because he was given a squadron long before guys who had been in longer than he had been were given one. So it was a sign that, he really had exemplary leadership skills. Now, there were some question marks on him, too. He had a couple of performance evaluations and reviews that were not so positive. They mentioned that he was over emotional and he needed to stay more on an even keel. And so when John L. actually brought the squadron into Guadalcanal, there was sort of a question mark hanging over his head. You know, what kind of leader was he really going to be? And, you know, 223 was his first command. He barely knew the guys. They had only gotten into the squadron to flush it out 2 months before they reached Guadalcanal, so it wasn't even 2 months. Most of the guys came into the squadron between the first week of July and mid-July, and then there was some horse trading with some other squadrons to get more experienced guys in. You know, John L. was kind of an unknown. He had flashes of real leadership ability, and he was a phenomenal pilot. But again, there was a big question mark surrounding him, and he more than dispelled that over the course of the next couple of weeks on Guadalcanal, where his leadership ends up becoming the glue that holds the early Cactus Air Force together. Okay. And inspires the entire 1st Marine Division.
If I recall correctly, didn't he have 19 kills?
He did. He emerged from the Guadalcanal campaign as briefly the top American ace of World War II to that point. And so there was a huge parade in his honor, and when he went back home to his hometown in Oklahoma, he was given a gold watch by the citizens, and there's still a roadside plaque in his honor as a result of that accomplishment.
Okay.
So, yeah, he was an incredible fighter pilot. But the most important thing about him was that he was an extremely effective combat leader, and he very quickly bonded with his men. He ran the squadron in a very unusual fashion, and it actually ended up being a double-edged sword, because ultimately, while it held the guys together at the time, the closeness that he developed with his men ended up preying on him later on during the war and then after the war, and it really contributed to the end of his career. It's a very sad story, actually, we can get into later.
Okay. Now, let's talk about Richard Mangrum, who led the dive bombers. Please tell us about him.
So Dick Mangrum was from Seattle, Washington, and he was a straight hometown kid. Went to the University of Washington, became a Husky, joined the Marine Corps Reserve after I can't remember if it was during his law school years, because he went to law school, became a lawyer, and he was in the reserves, I think at the same time, became a pilot. He was one of the old school guys, lots of experience. You know, keep in mind that the pre-war Marine Corps Aviation, pre-war Marine Aviation only had a handful of pilots. I mean, we're talking like in 1940, I think there were maybe 250 to 350. Very, very, very small numbers. Just tiny. It was just a tiny component of the U.S. Navy. And Mangrum had gotten his wings in the late 20s and had flown pretty much everything the Navy had ever deployed through the 1930s. He flew off the Langley, which was the first aircraft carrier the U.S. ever built, flew off the Lexington, the Saratoga. He had just this illustrious career that had gone on all through the Depression. So he had arrived in VMSB 232 long before Pearl Harbor, and he was the XO in December of 41. And after the war began, what they did was they took all of the experienced pilots out of the existing units, and and they spread them around and used them as the cadres for new squadrons. So they kept Mangrum in place with one or two other old hands, and he became the skipper of 232.
Okay, wow. I mean, and his younger pilots were able to respond to his leadership, and they got great results, didn't they?
Yes, absolutely. So the interesting thing about Mangrum is that he had a completely different style of leadership from John L. Smith.
Okay.
John L. was the Newt Rockney. He was going to give you speeches. He was going to be in your face if you messed up. He would be your most loyal ally if he was in your unit and you needed to be backed up. He always had his guys' back. But he was very emotional. He was also hot-tempered, so if somebody screwed up, he would chew them out. Dick Mangrum, he had the eloquence of a trial lawyer, the intellect of a Supreme Court justice, and the smooth, almost casual attitude of somebody who was totally unruffled in high-stress situations. He's really just an amazing personality. And he leveraged that. Every now and then he would sort of break the mold that his men expected of him, and he would do or say something that would just completely cut them up. And it wasn't often, but he did it judiciously at times where the squadron really needed a laugh. And the first couple of hours they were on the ground at Guadalcanal, or really first hour, he did that. He made a really off-color joke that just stopped everybody cold because we never heard him tell an off-color joke before.
Wow.
So he was a remarkable leader of his own right, and he was a fearless. Well, I shouldn't say fearless because that's so overdone. The best and most effective combat aviators learn to control their fear or use it, and he did that masterfully. And there was one mission where he actually dove on a Japanese convoy. His bomb refused to release. He pulled out of the dive, realized he still had the bomb, climbed back up to altitude even though he was low on fuel, and went back and made a solo attack. And while the rest of the squadron went home. And because of that, there was a late effort after his passing in the 80s. The few surviving men in the squadron and officers attempted to get Mangrum the Medal of Honor, which I do believe he deserved just as much as Gaylor and John L. And both of them received the MOH. So Mangrum was repeatedly slighted, which was a shame, but he never seemed to mind. And ultimately, he rose to the highest position of any of the guys who were there during that 53 days in terms of their, career advancement. He became the vice commandant for aviation of the Marine Corps in the late 60s.
Wow. Okay. Now, let's talk about the third man featured in your book. You talk about Marion Carl, and he went through an enormous ordeal. Your book talks about a great ordeal he went through. Please tell our audience about that ordeal he went through.
So Marion Carl was an Oregonian. He was also the very first World War II vet I ever interviewed. I met him in grad school just a couple of days after the air campaign started in the first Gulf War in January of 1991. And he was tall and lanky and spoke with deliberate diction and was just a steel-belted type of person. I mean, he was a total gentleman, and at the same time, you could tell that, there was just steel underneath. He was one tough dude. And he had to have been, because he grew up a hard scrabble on a dairy farm in Hubbard, Oregon, bootstrap his way through college, even though he didn't really like the whole educational experience. College was a means to an end for him, which was he wanted to be a fighter pilot in the Marine Corps. And so he joined the Marines and began flying, and he was ultimately successful and became part of the only Marine Corps fighter squadron then active prior to the war. Now, before he got to Guadalcanal, he was on Midway.
Ooh.
And he was with VMF 221 and was launched against the Japanese strike that came inbound to destroy Midway on June 4th, 1942.
Wow.
And 19 of 25 Brewster Buffaloes and F-4F Wildcats from the squadron were shot down, and most of the pilots were killed in action. Marion survived, although his plane was very badly shot up, and he was able to shoot a Zero down. So he had what I call in the book, there were these Midway veterans who had flown one combat mission in Wildcats or Buffaloes, and they had what almost no other Marine Corps pilots had at that time, which was combat experience. But it was 60 minutes of combat. So they were, I call them the 60-minute veterans in the book. And when they were fleshing out 223 before Guadalcanal, they took a couple of the Midway survivors and put them into 223 to help the new kids who were straight from the training schools in the States. And they didn't have hardly any time in fighters, let alone in the fighters that they were going to be taking to Guadalcanal, which was the F-4F-4 Wildcat. So Marion Carl was the institutional experience of what it was like to face the Japanese for John L. Smith's squadron.
Wow.
And he also proved to be, there was a lot of talk as to who was the actual best Marine Corps fighter pilot pre-war. Most people think Marion was probably either number one or number two. And there's a lot of talk over that. Joe Bauer was fighting. Joe Bauer was generally considered to be number one, although in mock combat, Marion Carl defeated him. So his skill set was unmatched. Let's put it that way in the Corps. And so he and John L. were kind of chasing each other through these 53 days as to who was going to actually come out of it as the top Marine Corps ace and actually top American ace at the time. And Marion was winning. And then on September 9th, 1942, he made a second. Normally, Marion was a very disciplined guy. He would make one pass on Japanese bombers and then clear out. This time, he didn't see any Japanese fighter escort, so he decided to make a second pass, and he and his wingman both got shot down.
Ouch.
And he ended up in the water east of the Marine perimeter, and some local Micronesians saved his life. Pulled him out of the water, got him to safety. There were Japanese patrols that were in the area. They narrowly avoided a couple of them. While they were trying to get through the jungle to get back to the perimeter, another patrol actually came into the village that Marion had spent a few days in, and stole everybody's chickens and food. So it was a very dangerous E&E, escape and evasion sort of scenario. And as it happened, while he was trying to get back via the jungle, General Kawaguchi was moving his entire brigade from the east side of the perimeter to the south side to launch what would become known as the Battle of Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge.
Ouch.
So there were thousands of Japanese troops between him and the perimeter, and when it became clear they couldn't get through the jungle that way, he went back to the village with the locals that had helped him, and they got a little skiff running with a little outboard motor that Marion tinkered with until he was able to get it to work. And they motored up the coast at night as the Battle of Bloody Ridge commenced. Jeez. And those 2 nights, he saw the bombardments, he saw and heard the sounds of battle. And he got back, I can't remember exactly what day it was, but he got ashore, got into a Jeep, got down to the airfield, and everybody was delighted to see him because they thought that he was dead, obviously, and he had been one of the 2, along with John L., who had been a huge inspiration to the Marines on the ground, especially after he shot down a Zero directly over the airfield at low altitude earlier in the 53 days deployment. The entire 1st Marine Division saw that kill, and so he was very much revered by everybody. So when he arrived, the legend is Vandegrift, or one of the other senior Marines, asked him, "Hey, John L. has beat your record right now. He's been racking up the kills while you've been in the jungle. What are you going to do about it?" And Marion allegedly replied, "Well, can you ground Smitty for 5 days?" I think what he really said was, "Well, I better get on it then," or something to that effect. But it makes a great story. Beautiful. Anyway, and they kept flying and fighting, and it was an ordeal. I mean, there were days where they would absolutely crush the Japanese. There were others where they fought them to a standstill, and then there were a couple, especially right at the end of the deployment, where they got caught climbing to interception altitude and bounced by the Japanese Zero escort in a way that set up this completely disadvantageous situation, and the Marines suffered pretty heavy losses. So it was a hard won fight every single time they went up in the air against the Japanese, because they were facing off against probably some of the most experienced veteran aviators in the world at that time. I mean, even the Luftwaffe didn't have pilots with the kind of hours that the Japanese Navy did at that point. There were guys in the units out of Rabaul who had been flying and fighting in combat since 1937. So they were 5-year veterans with well over 1,000 combat hours, and they were taking on Marines who were lucky to have had 10 hours in type before they joined their respective squadrons. And then, whatever they got in training, which was usually about, 200, maybe 300 hours total. So the experience disparity was massive. And yet these kids, these average Americans from, every walk of life and every socioeconomic background ended up fighting the Imperial Japanese military to a standstill. They didn't beat them, but they stopped them, and that was the huge contribution that they made. They set the table for the ultimate victory on Guadalcanal.
Let's talk about the overall conditions that the Marine pilots and the infantrymen on the ground had to endure on Guadalcanal. Because isn't it true the Marines were basically cut off for those first 53 days? Very little supplies ever got in. If so, how did they survive and fight and persevere in terms of food and material? What kept them going? Can you just talk about that?
Yeah, so when the Marines first landed, they pushed the 1st Marine Division ashore. The senior U.S. Navy admiral in the area, a guy named Admiral Gormley, did not believe that this was going to be a successful operation, and he was very reluctant to risk ships to support the Marines. At the same time, there was a Japanese task force that came down and sank 4 Allied cruisers the night after the invasion was successfully carried out. Yeah. Well, between that and severe air attacks, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who was in command of the carrier, the U.S. Navy carrier group that was protecting the Marines, decided that he needed to pull out. And when he made that decision, Richmond Kelly Turner, who was in charge of the transports, offloading the supplies the Marines would need, decided that he couldn't stick around without air support. So the Navy left, and they left the Marines with almost no food, 3 days worth of ammunition, and that was basically it.
Jeez.
And fortunately, what saved this whole operation was when they invaded Guadalcanal. They caught the Japanese so completely by surprise that they were able to capture huge stocks of food, of equipment, construction material. The Marines there were able to actually finish the construction of Henderson Field, the airfield that the Cactus Air Force flew out of. They were able to finish it with Japanese construction equipment and construction vehicles. Otherwise, they never would have been able to do it. And then when the Marine aviators arrived, they arrived without any sort of ground echelon. The ground echelon had not arrived, so the gunners and some of the pilots in 232 slept under the wings of their aircraft and maintained themselves in the field until the ground echelon arrived. But when the ground echelon arrived, most of their equipment did not come with them, so they had a lack of tools to work on the aircraft. There was no, functional hangar to work on them indoors. So everything was done outside in the elements. They didn't have bomb carts, so all of the bombs that were loaded on the SPD Dolins's had to be loaded by hand.
Jeez.
It was a tremendously rugged and primitive situation, to the point where when they first arrived, they didn't even have field mess kits, so they had no way to get food. There was a Marine artillery unit stationed nearby, and they actually were able to get some of their gear. Otherwise, they would have been eating, rice out of their hands. So it was a terrible situation in terms of the living conditions and the food. But then to make it all worse, you had the Japanese were only a few thousand meters away.
Yeah.
They were infiltrating constantly. They were shooting at the ground crew while they were working on the planes. Periodically, everybody had to take cover. And then you had the disease. Very quickly, the guys started getting sick with different stomach ailments, with different tropical diseases. I mean, it's just a case study of all the different types of jungle maladies that you could get. These aviators got. And then when the rainy season began in force in September, that's when malaria started running through the ranks, and it became a very, very dicey situation. And in fact, probably half of 232 ended up getting medically evacuated because they were so sick.
Yeah. Besides Mary and Carl, how many other pilots were you able to interview for this book?
Unfortunately, not very many. I was able to interview extensively Dennis Byrd, who was Dick Mangram's backseat gunner. And it was kind of an interesting situation how we met. At the time, in the 90s, I was working for a company called Dynamics. We made flight simulators, computer games. Red Baron was one of our first. And then we did Aces of the Pacific. And one day I get this letter sitting on my desk at the Dynamics office from Dennis Byrd. And he wrote, "My grandkids have asked me for years what it was like to fly with Richard Mangrum at Guadalcanal and Dauntless. And now I no longer have to tell them because your game, I just show them your game."
Beautiful. Beautiful.
Yeah, several of the historic missions we included were 232's missions. So I I wrote him back, and we became friends, and he sent me material that became a critical complement of the book, because he had become the unofficial historian for 232. And he had gathered tons of material. He had gathered memories from the surviving members of the unit. So there were lots and lots of letters that he sent me that the guys in the unit wrote him and shared memories with him. He wrote articles for the Guadalcanal Veterans newsletter, and he had also started writing his memoirs about the experience. He also had been corresponding for quite a while with Dick Mangrum, who retired as a lieutenant general, and he and Dennis had remained friends their entire lives. He had stood up as Dennis's best man at his wedding, and pinned his wings on him when Dennis went to flight school and became a Corsair pilot later on in the war.
Wow.
So they had a very, very special bond, the survivors of the squadron. And the memories and the material that Dennis provided to me in the late 90s became a cornerstone for much of what I knew about 232 going into this project.
Okay. John, let's talk about yourself now. Where were you born and raised, and where did you go to college?
So I was born and raised in Saratoga, California. I was a Silicon Valley kid. My dad was first wave tech entrepreneur. So I graduated in 1986, and I wanted to see another part of the world. And the University of Oregon offered me that opportunity. So I ended up as a University of Oregon Fighting Duck, majoring in history, and I was just thinking about this the other day when my dad and mom dropped me off at the dorms. That my freshman year, my dad looked at me and he was like, "You're really going to study history?" I said, "Yeah, I am." It's like, "Okay, well, you're going to starve and you can't come home." And I knew that it was actually, I had disappointed in that I wasn't going to become a computer science major or something like that. I'm sure I would have been terrible at that. I have no actual visible skill set except research, maybe photography, and hopefully writing. But I won him over gradually. And I used to tell him that this was his fault because he had grown up around the Marine base at El Toro during World War II. Corsair had crash landed in front of his house. Pilot climbed out and asked him to use the house phone. Those sorts of things caused him to have a lifelong interest and love of World War II aviation, which translated to me and also to my son. So we've got multi-generational influence here on this front. So I studied at the University of Oregon. I started grad school at the U of O. At the same time, I ended up working at this computer company at Dynamics. And in 1996, I was designing Aces of the Pacific 2? No, I was designing Red Baron 2. And I decided I needed to go write my master's thesis before the guys all passed. I was writing about an ace by the name of Gerald R. Johnson, who was Oregon's top fighter ace from World War II. And I quit my job, took a leap of faith, and a year, 8 months later, I got my first book contract, which was actually for Crimson Sky, the book I wrote on Korea. And then a couple years later, the book on Gerald Johnson came out called Jungle Ace. And then after I experienced combat myself, I went back and I wrote Race of Aces, which is the story of Gerald Johnson, Neil Kirby, Dick Bong, and Tommy McGuire, and Charles McDonald, as they all vied to become the top ace from the Southwest Pacific Theater.
Okay. Now, John, you have covered a wide variety of military historical topics. Is there one that you haven't taken on yet that you still would love to take on? Any undiscovered country in terms of your military research?
Oh, yeah, actually. I have never... I did some documentary script writing for 4 years for a company called EDI. We made aviation and military documentaries, and I got a chance to write an 8-hour documentary series on the Civil War. Ooh. But I've never written a book on the Civil War. And what I have discovered here in Oregon is that there's a very, very unusual connection to the Civil War, and I would love to be able to write about that particular connection. And its roots are all in the guerrilla war in Missouri. And that has become just a point of fascination for me. So I think before I call it a career, I would very much like to be able to write about the Civil War in Missouri.
Okay. Now, John, whenever I interview an author, I always love to ask the standard question. When you were growing up, who were your favorite authors? And of those favorite authors, did any of them inspire you to become a writer or perhaps influence your personal writing style?
Well, I do have favorites for sure.
Okay.
You know, growing up, I read everything Edward Sims wrote: Greatest Fighter Missions, Great American Fighter Pilots of World War II. I can't remember if he wrote that. I read everything that John Toland wrote. John Toland was an amazing historian. In my book, I remember in grad school, some of my professors just dissed him, but I am still a firm believer that John Toland was a fantastic historian. And there was Eric Hamill was another one. I remember reading his books on Guadalcanal in college, and then when Eric and I ended up meeting in the 90s, it was like I had just met Joe Montana.
Yeah.
I was just blown away. And Eric became he mentored me for years, and I really owe a good chunk of my career and my success to the things that Eric taught me, for sure.
Okay.
But I also love John Steinbeck. We had to read Steinbeck in high school, and being a California kid, I was always fascinated by the connections there. And so East of Eden, Sweet Thursday, Cannery Row, those became staples of mine. And then last, I would have to say McKinley Cantor. McKinley was a writer all through the 30s, did a lot of fiction writing, and then at age 40-something, he wanted to join the war effort in World War II. They wouldn't let him. He was too old. So he went over as a credentialed correspondent and ended up flying missions with the 305th Bomb Group, attached himself to the Third Army, and went all through the ground war in Europe with the Third Army, and ultimately was at Buchenwald when it was liberated. And he came back and he wrote a beautiful poetic novel called Glory for Me, which is one of the most incredible works on World War II I've ever read. And that became the basis for the movie The Best Years of Our Lives. So I have to mention McKinley. And then when I went to Afghanistan in 2010, I was very much motivated and inspired by what McKinley Cantor had done. So I carried a copy of Glory for Me on every mission that I went on except one. And the one where I forgot it back at my hooch at Fob Shank, we ended up in a precautionary landing in the middle of the Hindu Kush with a Chinook that was starting to catch fire. So after that, I had to make sure that was in my pack every time I left.
Okay.
No problem.
John, please tell our listeners, where can readers find your great library of books?
Well, Amazon is probably the easiest. They're available at bookstores everywhere. You can go to a Barnes & Noble, or if you're in Portland, Oregon, Powell's. That's an incredible bookstore. They usually have most of my books, or at least some of them. The kids, whenever they go up to Portland and they go to Powell's, they spend too much money on books up there, which I never got mad at them for. They will actually go and find my books and take selfies with them and send them to me. It always makes me happy.
Beautiful.
So, yeah.
Beautiful. John, what is your next book project, and when can we expect its release?
Well, I'm actually working right now on the story of a mining engineer who was sort of a failed gold prospector, ne'er-do-well, who ends up changing the course of the last 18 months of the Pacific War when he and his band of Filipino guerrillas captured the Japanese Navy's chief of staff and their entire defense plan for the Western Pacific.
Wow.
And it's called The Pursuit of Plan Z, and it's the story of the Cebu guerrillas and James Cushing and his role, which has really just been an unheralded one. I love telling stories about people who really deserved more credit than they ever received, and this one has really become near and dear to my heart because Cushing is such an interesting guy, and the guerrillas, the Filipinos who were loyal and fought with him through years and years of some of the most brutal counterinsurgency warfare I've ever encountered, bar none. It just makes for a phenomenal story.
And when will it be released? Was it next year?
I hope so, yeah. I actually was supposed to finish it up this last summer. My mom died January 7th of 2024, and then my dad fell seriously ill, so I've been dealing with the family issues for a year. But I just got back from California, saying goodbye to my dad earlier this month. And on Monday, I'm going to hit the ground running again, and I really can't wait to just start writing again,
Well, please let me know when it comes out. I want you on my show again. You're always welcome, John.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Matt. I really appreciate it. And this was an extraordinary time for me today, so thank you very much for having me.
And interesting, 3 days from now will be the anniversary of when Guadalcanal was finally secured by American forces, February 7th, 1943.
Yeah, it's a cornerstone moment in our history, and I wonder how many people will even remember it. It'll be interesting to see if there's stories in the mainstream press or not. But yeah, the Guadalcanal campaign, had it gone the other way, had the Marines been pushed off the island, or the Japanese had, captured them, the entire shape of the Pacific War would have been drastically altered.
Absolutely. Basically, Guadalcanal was the hinge of fate.
Oh, truly. That's a great way to put it. It really was.
John, you take care, okay?
Hey, you too, and thanks again, Matt. You have a great evening.
You too. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, for next week's show where I will be interviewing sports author David Finoli. Thank you and good night.